time.
Sunny days, sweeping the clouds away, going to where the air is free. That was pretty bad, wasn't it? Can you tell me how to get to, where am I trying to get to? Sesame Street. All right. I used to love that show. I'll never forget. Cookie Monster was my favorite. Cookie Monster. And I actually have a book at home. Sesame Street book. And in that book, there's a Cookie Monster cookie recipe that my mother claims she used to make these homemade cookies from that recipe all the time. Now, I do have the book, but I sure don't remember no homemade cookies. But anyway, Bert and Ernie and Oscar the Grouch and the Snuffleupagus. He was the cutest thing. But do you remember a character in Sesame Street named Mr. Hooper? Who remembers Mr. Hooper? Anybody? Sesame Street had a problem. Mr. Hooper got sick and died. And Sesame Street had to somehow explain death to a huge audience, most of which were under 6 years old. So they called in all these child psychologists. They called them all the most brilliant people around dealing with kids. And they told Sesame Street what not to do. They said, well, we don't want to say that he got sick and died, because, little children get sick and most likely they're not going to die. So they said, don't say that. Well, we don't want to say he was old and he died, because, a 6-year-old thinks their parents are old and they're going to think they're just going to croak any day. So don't say that. They decided they didn't want to enter into any religious debate, so they weren't going to say he died and went to heaven. So, the episode finally came. The day of the show, Big Bird came out on the stage and said he had a picture for Mr. Hooper, and he couldn't wait to see him. But somebody said, well, Big Bird, remember we told you Mr. Hooper died. Well, Big Bird said, okay, well, I'll just give him to him when I see him, when he comes back. And then one of the show's producers puts his arm around Big Bird and says, Big Bird, Mr. Hooper isn't coming back. Well, why not? Big Bird said. And he said, Big Bird, when people die, they don't come back. And that's how that particular episode ended. When we turn to the resurrection narratives, I think if you'd asked the disciples, they'd have said the same thing. I think if you'd asked the ladies that went to the tomb that morning, they would have believed exactly what Sesame Street said. That once people die, they don't come back. I don't think the ladies, as they were going to the tomb on that Sunday morning, thought they were going to meet something or someone who had been resurrected. They had watched Jesus die. And they thought, it's over. He's dead. And he's not coming back. They were talking, Mark says, about who would help them roll the stone away. It was a big stone. And they get to where the tomb is. And they are expecting to find a dead Jesus. They are expecting him to still be in the tomb. They are expecting him not to come back. And it's interesting when you read the different accounts. Now, I began the service by reading from Luke. In Luke, they see the angel. The angel asks them, why are you seeking the living among the dead? He's risen. Now go tell his disciples. And in Luke, most of the women run and they're just so happy, and they go and they tell the disciples that Jesus is risen. But Luke tells us, and read Luke 24, 1 through 12 when you get home. Luke tells us that when the disciples hear it, they think it's nonsense. Because to the disciples, once you're dead, you don't come back. And then we have John's account. In John's account, John only zeroes in on one woman. John only focused his attention on Mary Magdalene. One of the reasons I think the disciples did not believe the women is because Mary Magdalene didn't tell them the same thing the other women did. It's amazing when you read Luke's gospel, the women go and they say he is risen. When you read John's gospel, Mary goes back and says, well, somebody's done taken him away, and I don't know where they put him. So Peter and John run to the tomb. Now, I've always pictured Peter as, well, let me just put it like this. I've always pictured John as, in shape, athletic build, just like me. And he's really running. And I've always pictured Peter is not quite as athletic. So Peter doesn't get there as quick as John does. And John goes and John finds a tomb, and John looks down and John believes. John says, guess what? He is risen. Now Jesus had told him. He said, tear down this temple and I'll build it up in 3 days. In fact, even the religious leaders had heard the prophecy. That's why they went to Pilate and said, hey, Pilate, we need to do something. We need to put a guard at this tomb. Peter, he stoops in, he looks, and he walks away scratching his head. He walks away bewildered. And it's interesting when you read the accounts. It simply says that Peter went home. I love the way Don Francisco pictures Peter that morning. You may have, I'm sure you've heard the song that he wrote, but let me just read you some of the lyrics. We both ran toward the garden, and John ran on ahead. We found the stone and the empty tomb, just like Mary had said. But the winding sheet they wrapped him in was just an empty shell. And how or where they'd taken him was more than I could tell. Well, something strange had happened there, but just what I didn't know. John believed a miracle, but I just turned to go. Circumstance and speculation couldn't lift me very high because I'd seen them crucify him. And I watched him die. Back inside the house again, the guilt and anguish came, and everything I promised him just added to my shame. When at last it came to choices, I denied I knew his name, and even if he were alive, it wouldn't be the same. From the song, He's Alive. Y'all, I'm sure have heard Dolly Parton sing it. And I think he did a good job of really capturing what Peter must have been thinking. John believes, okay? I think Peter wants to. But something deep within Peter says, Peter, even if it is true, if he is alive, well, Peter, you've got a lot of explaining to do. And Mary, well, John says Mary's just standing outside crying. Mary's just standing outside weeping. Mary had heard the prophecies. Mary had heard the angel. But Mary had watched him die too. Mary had been there. And dead people don't come back, Mary's thinking. And I don't think Mary dared to believe, because Mary had already been hurt. Because Mary's hope had already been dashed. Because Mary had already believed, and she stood at the cross and watched him die. And she turns around. And there he stands. I don't know why she didn't recognize him. Something tells me her tear-filled eyes were still kind of teary. And something tells me her grief was so bad that when she turned around, she really wasn't even looking. And there he stands. And it's amazing. Mark tells us in Mark 16:9, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. There were all kinds of people Jesus could have appeared to. He could appear to his mother Mary, the woman who had given him birth. He could appear to the other women who had gotten the message right. He could have gone first to his apostles, but he doesn't do that. He appears to Mary Magdalene, the woman who couldn't even believe an angel. Think about that. The first person he appears to is a woman who was told by an angel that Jesus was alive, and she didn't believe him. He calls out her name, and that wasn't the first time she'd heard that voice speak that name. And all of a sudden, she realizes who it is. She realizes who it is. And suddenly her crying stops. Now, I don't think Mary opposed the idea of Jesus rising from the dead. I just don't think she thought it could happen. I think she stood there like Big Bird on Sesame Street, and in her mind she thought, when people die, they don't come back. And so the grave was an empty hole in the ground. It was a place of hopelessness, and death was the end of all existence. And she thought she would never see this man again. She thought everything she had hoped for was in vain. But then she sees Jesus, and everything changed. It's amazing Jesus could have appeared to anyone he wanted to, but all those others believed he had risen from the grave, and he chose Mary because she didn't. And he chose Mary because she needed to be reminded of his message right then. She needed to be reminded of what Isaiah had promised. When Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 25:8 that he will swallow up death in victory, and that the Lord God will wipe tears away from all of the faces. She needed to be reminded of what Paul would quote in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, when the perishable has been clothed with imperishable and the mortal with immortality, then the saying will be true, what was written, death has been swallowed up in victory. She needed to be reminded what the writer of Hebrews said when he said, since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too shared their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death. When Jesus rose from the dead, he came to break the bonds of sin and death. And that's the very core of our belief. And Paul uses a phrase in 1 Corinthians that it sounds real churchy and it's real hard to get your mind around it. But Paul says Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. 1 Corinthians 15:20. That Jesus is the first fruits. Now, when we think of first fruits, it's kind of hard to get our mind around it. But we've got to remember in this day and age, when Paul is writing to these folks, they couldn't go down to the grocery store and get fruit if it wasn't in season, okay? They didn't ship everything in from Guatemala and Mexico and Chile and all these other places like we do. If it wasn't in season, guess what? They didn't get it. Now, how many of y'all like tomatoes? I don't like tomatoes. And I know I'm weird, but I had much rather have a winter tomato from the grocery store than a homegrown. I know I'm weird, right? How many of you love homegrown tomatoes? And you can't wait till summer because you're going to get that homegrown tomato. And some of you might even go down to the garden and just bite into it like an apple when you get that first tomato. Well, think of it like this. In this time and in this day, the only time you got tomatoes was in season, okay? You didn't get them any time. And when you planted your tomato vines, you looked and you waited and you checked every day. Is a tomato ripe? Is a tomato ripe? And you couldn't wait. And finally, that first tomato came in, and you made just some cornbread or a biscuit, and you put that thing on it, and it was so good, and you were so happy because you knew once the first tomato was in, what else was going to happen? The rest of them are going to come in too. And the first fruit tells you what the rest of the harvest is going to be like. All right. If Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, and Jesus rose, what's going to happen to the rest of us? We're going to rise too. Jesus was the first fruits, and because he lives, he says, those who believe in me will never die. Oh, that's good news. Oh, that's good stuff. The great preacher of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Dr. W.A. Criswell, said on one occasion he was on an airplane and he found himself sitting beside a well-known theologian. The man told Dr. Criswell how his little boy had just died. He said the child had come home from school with a fever. He thought, well, it's just one of those little childhood things. He's got a cold or something and he'll be okay. But turns out he had a very, very serious form of meningitis. They called the doctor. Doctor said, well, we can't save your little boy. He's going to die. And so the seminary professor, loving his son as he did, sat beside the bedside of his dying child. It was the middle of the day. And the little boy's vision began to get dark. He said, "Daddy, it's getting dark, isn't it?" The professor said to his son, "Yes, son, it's getting dark, very dark." "Daddy, I guess it's time for me to go to sleep then, isn't it?" "Yes, son, it's time for you to go to sleep." The professor said his son had a way of fixing his pillow just so, and putting his head in his hands when he slept. And that's what the little boy did. He said, "Good night, Daddy. I'll see you in the morning." Then he closed his eyes, and he never woke up again. Dr. Criswell said the professor stared out the window and for what seemed like ages never said anything. Then he turned, looked at Dr. Criswell with tears streaming down his face, and he said, "Dr. Criswell, I can't wait till morning. I can't wait till morning." Because you see, he knew Sesame Street had it wrong. He knew that, yes, if you believe in Jesus, you will come back. In fact, Paul said that we don't want you to be ignorant about those who have fallen asleep. We don't want you to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe Jesus died and rose again, and we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep. And we believe that the sound of the trumpet and the shout of the archangel is going to happen, and the dead in Christ are going to rise first. And then we who are alive, we're going to meet Jesus in the air, and we're going to be with him forever and forever. I can't wait till morning. And John tells us what Jesus showed him about that morning time. John tells us in Revelation, John says that I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the former heaven and earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling is with us, and he will dwell with men, and they will be his people. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more." I can't wait till morning. Because one day he's coming back. And he's going to call my name. And I'm going to see him as he is, face to face. And the only thing I can think of to say now is what a day that's going to be. What a day that's going to be when my Jesus I'm going to see, and I'm going to get to look on the face of the one who saved me by his grace, the one who overcome death, the one who once and for all defeated every foe we will ever have. I can't wait till morning. The good news, morning's coming. Morning's coming. And the good news is, Jesus was the first fruits, and we're the harvest. I can't wait till morning.